Vistam 151, go around.
Go around, Vistam 151.
Vistam 151, heavy, thanks. The last departure lost the wheel on departure, so we're going to have to shut the runway down. So fly runway heading and maintain 3000.
Roger, Vistam 151.
Omicron 7 heavy, we're going to have to...
Welcome to Brasher Warning, the podcast that dives deep into aviation incidents with sharp analysis, insightful discussions, and just a touch of edge. If you're passionate about aviation and love a good post-incident breakdown, you're in the right place. Before we take off, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share with your crew. Let's get into it.
Imagine this. You're a pilot on a routine cargo flight. The moonlit Pacific Ocean below you. When suddenly, thud, you feel it in the pit of your stomach. That's the reality that hit the crew of Transair Flight 810, a Boeing 737 cargo plane that ended up ditching off the coast of Honolulu. And luckily for us, we've got the NTSB's incredibly detailed report on what happened, the transcript from the cockpit voice recorder, or CVR.
And what makes this deep dive so fascinating is that it wasn't just a straightforward case of equipment failure with a whole chain of events, decisions made under immense pressure, the ever-present element of human error, and frankly, a good dose of luck. That's factored into both the ditching and the fact that both pilots survived.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's July 2nd, 2021. Just after 1:30 in the morning, Transair Flight 810 is making a routine cargo run from Honolulu to Kahului, basically island hopping between the Hawaiian Islands.
And that's an important detail to remember as we go, because these were experienced pilots who knew this route well. But as we'll see, even familiarity with a flight path doesn't make you immune to the effects of stress fatigue and all those human elements that come into play during an emergency.
Right. We've got a captain and a first officer. The report tells us the captain was 58, with over 15,000 flight hours under his belt, and the first officer, who was 50 at the time, had over 5,000. Definitely not rookies. What I find interesting, though, is that the report actually digs into their work schedules, specifically the captain's, which was described as unpredictable, lots of early morning starts, multiple flight legs per day, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And while the report doesn't definitively say fatigue was the cause of what happened, it acknowledges that this kind of schedule can absolutely impact a pilot's performance. It can affect your reaction time, your decision-making. It's like trying to run a marathon after pulling an all-nighter.
And it makes you wonder, listening to the CVR transcript, if those long hours and early mornings were weighing on them even before takeoff, because they were actually chatting about another pilot's behavior on a previous flight for a while before things got hairy.
Yes, and we'll circle back to those conversations later on, because I think they provide some subtle clues about the dynamics between these two pilots, maybe even some underlying stress or tension. But for now, just file that away. The fatigue angle in those cockpit conversations, they'll become important as we go deeper.
Got it. So to recap, we've got our experienced crew a familiar flight path, but maybe a bit of fatigue lurking in the background. And then just minutes after takeoff, as they're climbing over the dark Pacific, that's when they hear it, that thud.
And you can almost hear the tension in the captain's voice when he repeats the Mayday call to air traffic control, because it seems like the controller didn't catch it the first time. This highlights how even a simple miscommunication can amplify stress in an already high-pressure situation.
Absolutely. The NTSB report confirms their initial assessment was spot on. The right engine had suffered a sudden partial loss of power. And this is where the technical stuff gets interesting, because they were dealing with something called stress rupture in two of the turbine blades. Basically, tiny cracks formed over time due to a combination of heat and corrosion, and eventually those blades just disintegrated mid-flight.
And the really unsettling part is that one of those blades was manufactured in 1968. Think about that. Almost 50 years old, which speaks to the incredible lifespan of these engines, but also raises questions about the limits of materials and maintenance.
It does make you think about those pre-flight checks, right? But, okay, so they're dealing with engine failure, which, while not ideal, is something pilots train for extensively. What's wild is that it's the identification of the correct engine, where things start to really unravel.
You're right. Initially, they get it right. The thud, the way the aircraft yawed the engine readings, it all pointed to the right engine as the problem. But then we start to see the impact of stress and possibly fatigue taking hold.
Because in those first few minutes after the thud, while the captain's making those Mayday calls and instructing the first officer on headings and altitudes, things get a little muddled.
Right. And the first officer, who's flying at this point, makes a decision that, while seemingly logical in the moment, would have huge consequences. He reduces power to both engines. Later, he'd tell investigators he'd been trained to do this in a simulator, to bring both levers down together, until they could confirm which engine was the problem.
Okay. But here's the catch. By that point, they had confirmed it was the right engine. So why reduce power to the perfectly good left engine?
Exactly. And this is where those human factors we talked about really come into play. The NTSB report suggests the first officer was dealing with a heavy cognitive load. He's trying to fly the plane, manage the initial engine issues, process the captain's instructions. It's a lot to juggle. And then you add in the stress of a real-life emergency happening at night over the ocean.
With their lives and the lives of anyone else on board in his hands.
Yeah.
It's got to be overwhelming.
Absolutely. And remember those questions we had about whether the first officer might have been fatigued as well. The report mentions that he had a demanding schedule too. He was juggling his pilot duties with being a lawyer.
Wow, talk about a high-pressure career combo.
Right. So you've got those long hours.
Yeah.
Potentially adding another layer of fatigue, which, again, the NTSB couldn't definitively say how much it played a role. But they acknowledged it as a definite possibility that could have clouded his judgment.
So now we've got a situation where they've unintentionally reduced power to the one good engine. The plane is losing altitude. And to make matters worse, the crew is working under the mistaken assumption that they've lost the left engine. How does that happen?
Well, you might think it sounds crazy. But remember, the captain wasn't directly monitoring the first officer's actions. In those crucial moments after the initial engine issue, he was preoccupied with those Mayday calls, trying to cut through the static and make sure they were heard by air traffic control. The report suggests that in all of the commotion, the captain was simply unaware that the left engine's thrust had been almost completely reduced.
Okay, but wouldn't they have noticed something was off? Like, wouldn't the plane have responded differently if the left engine had truly failed?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But remember, they're already operating under the assumption that the left engine is the problem. Plus, they're getting readings that the right engine is overheating, which makes perfect sense considering it's now doing all the heavy lifting, trying to compensate for the idling left engine.
So they're essentially chasing the wrong problem, convinced that they're about to experience a double engine failure.
Exactly. And here's where something from those earlier cockpit conversations becomes really important. Before takeoff, the captain actually mentioned a previous incident where he'd been criticized for not using a checklist during an emergency. It's like that experience is looming over him, because in this case, he becomes very insistent on using the engine failure checklist.
But they don't actually complete it, right?
No, they don't. The first officer starts going through the conditions for performing the checklist, but he keeps getting interrupted. First, it's the concern about the right engine overheating. Then it's the alarming rate at which the plane is losing altitude. It's a classic example of how even the most well-rehearsed procedures can get derailed in the heat of the moment.
So checklist or no checklist, they're still laser-focused on the wrong engine. And the plane is going down. What happens next?
It's a desperate situation. They're fighting to maintain altitude, the stick shaker's going off the ground, proximity warnings are blaring. You can hear the urgency in their voices on the CVR recording. Finally, with very few options left, the captain tells the controller they're preparing for a water landing.
And this is where the story takes a turn. That's both terrifying and almost unbelievable. Most ditchings, especially at night in the open ocean, they don't have happy endings.
You're telling me. But somehow, against all odds, both pilots survive. The NTSB report does a great job of recreating the scene. The plane breaks apart on impact. The captain manages to get out through a cockpit window and is found clinging to the floating tail section. The first officer's thrown from the cockpit and ends up clinging to a pallet of debris. It's incredible.
It's like something out of a movie. I can't believe they survived that.
He really is a testament to their training. And frankly, a good dose of luck.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to consider the force of that impact. They were incredibly lucky to escape with their lives. There's even a detail in the report about how the first officer's seat actually collapsed during the impact.
Yep.
Turns out the seat was over 30 years old and only met safety standards from way back in the 70s. The NTSB actually flags this as the potential concern for cargo plane regulations, suggesting that older seats might not be as safe as they could be.
So they're lucky to be alive. Lucky the seats didn't fail even worse. This whole thing just seems like one close call after another.
It really does. And that's what makes this NTSB report so fascinating. It goes beyond just a technical analysis of what went wrong and tries to understand the why. It circles back to those human factors we talked about: stress workload, possible fatigue, and how even the most experienced pilots can make critical errors under pressure. It's a valuable lesson for all of us, regardless of our profession.
So we've got this chain of events, misunderstandings, near misses. But what are the real takeaways here?
That's the question, isn't it? It's easy to listen to this story and think, wow, those pilots made some serious mistakes. But I think it's more valuable to look at it as a study of human behavior under extreme pressure and to ask ourselves, what would we have done differently in those moments?
That's a great point. It's easy to judge from the outside, but being in that cockpit with the adrenaline pumping, the alarms blaring, that's a whole different ballgame.
Absolutely. And that's why the NTSB report emphasizes the importance of not just understanding what happened, but why those decisions were made. For example, let's go back to that moment. When the first officer reduces power to both engines, he later said he was following his training. But in the chaos of the situation, that training might have actually worked against him.
It's almost like he overcorrected, right? Early in his career, he's praised for following checklists to the letter. Then later, he's criticized for sticking to them too rigidly. It makes you wonder how pilots are supposed to find that balance between procedure and instinct.
It's a delicate balance for sure. And this case really highlights the limits of even the most well-designed procedures. Checklists are essential in aviation. They help pilots manage complex tasks and avoid errors, but they can't account for every single variable.
So it's a reminder that even in highly trained, procedure-driven fields, human error is inevitable. And sometimes the best course of action isn't always crystal clear.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so compelling. It's not just a technical analysis of a plane crash. It's a study of human behavior under extreme pressure. It reminds us that we all make mistakes, especially when we're stress fatigued and facing the unexpected.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one. And speaking of important thoughts, any final takeaways for our listeners before we wrap up?
I think the key takeaway here is the importance of clear communication, especially in high-stress situations. If the captain and first officer had been able to maintain a clearer picture of what the other was doing, it's possible some of those critical errors could have been avoided.
That's such a crucial point, and it applies to so many areas of life, not just aviation, whether you're in a boardroom or on a mountaintop. Being able to communicate effectively under pressure is essential.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, I'll leave you with this. Think back to that moment when you first heard the word thud. What are your instincts telling you? What would you do differently? It's a question worth pondering. Because ultimately, this deep dive isn't just about one plane crash. It's a glimpse into the complexities of human decision-making, the limits of procedures.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those questions. Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.
Thanks for tuning in to Brasher Warning. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a flight with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment or review, and don't forget to share the podcast with your fellow aviation enthusiasts. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and keep soaring.
American 1552, contact center 127.0.
1552, we're going to be Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We have an engine failure. We're going to return to DFW.
1552, roger. And which runway do you need?
We'll take 18 right.
Roger, American 1552, turn right heading 020, just going to maintain 8,000.